Okay, we're continuing on, and I'd remind you that what this area is the punishments on the enemies of Israel. And so we're just continuing on with that. We're in chapter 22, beginning with verse 24. And it's kind of the closing part is a prophecy of the Messiah. On him will depend all the glory of his family, his descendants and offsprings, and all the smaller vessels too, from cups to pitchers. What they're talking about is the Messiah, and when they're talking about the cups and pitchers, they're talking about the things that were stolen from the temple. So they're talking about the glory will be restored anyway. That day, declares the Lord Sabaoth, the nail driven to a firm place will give way. It will be cut down and fall, and the whole load on it will be lost, for the Lord God has spoken. And this idea of the nail in the firm place, a nail driven into a wall, is a strong thing. But while the nations look so strong, when this person rises, the Messiah, that their power will be broken. And the interesting thing is the way the text is put together, their power will be broken not so much by what the Messiah does, but by who the Messiah is. The Messiah will have, this radiance. I always think of it in terms of Alexander. We talk about Alexander being a great general and everything. And Alexander, if you study him historically, he had a major battle that he won very early against the Persians, very powerfully. He had a smaller group and everything. And I think he was 17 or 18 when he did it. And he led this army, and they had just a fantastic victory. And then they went on to conquer Persia. The next thing he did was go down to the Israeli area and went to the city of Gaza. Now, Gaza was a strong city, but not anything like what he'd taken in Persia. And so they quickly overwhelmed Gaza. But when he overwhelmed Gaza, he took the king of Gaza and he tied the king of Gaza to the back of his chariot, and he circled the city until the king was dead and just left the body out there. Well, in the past, in the way they conducted battles, if you were going to attack a city, you always spared the king. You spared the king's family. The people who were really in charge did not fare badly in the whole thing, which made them more likely to decide to defend the city rather than surrender. But this combination of his early victory and then what he did at Gaza, normally a city surrendered when Alexander showed up. There were not a lot of battles. We think of him as that wasn't the way it was. He had one really great battle and this act of unbelievable savagery. And then after that, it was nice sailing. So that's the idea is the Messiah is just by his presence is going to do things. And now we go through a proclamation about Tyre. Tyre was probably the wealthiest city in the entire world at the time. If you look at a map today, if you go down the coast of Lebanon, there's a bubble that goes out, and that's Tyre. Originally, Tyre was a way off the coast, not a long way, but a way off the coast, and it was an outcropping of rock. And they literally built a fortress there, and it was impregnable. I mean, like if your moat is the ocean, it seems like you've got it made. But so they would be out there, and what Tyre became was basically a banking center. So that if you were let's say if you were king in some country, you sent gold and jewels and everything there because it was absolutely safe. If your country fell or you had to get out, Tyre was the place. So Tyre became just insanely wealthy. And people all looked at Tyre as totally impregnable. And I'm sure you've heard the story about Granada, but when Columbus was trying to get money from the King of Spain, Spain at the time the government in Spain at the time was engaged with a war of the Muslims, retaking the land from the Muslims in Spain. So the Columbus had trouble getting through to see the king, and when they were having the battle against Granada, then Columbus was able to see Isabella, and he saw her immediately after the battle. And she heard his plan and could see it was absolutely crazy, this idea of going across. And when the discussion finished, Columbus said to Isabella, he said, what did they say about Granada yesterday? Yesterday it was impregnable. And Columbus said, everything's impossible until somebody does it, you know. And that's Tyre. Tyre was that way. No one would have believed that Tyre could fall. Incidentally, I'll tell you how it fell historically. This is a prophecy beforehand. But how it fell historically was Alexander just took a bunch of slaves and poured dirt in and built a causeway out and marched his army right out, took the place over. So he says, proclamation about Tyre. This is chapter 23. Howl, ships of Tarshish, for the harbor has been destroyed. Tarshish is an area south of Israel, not into Egypt, but south of Israel. When they came from the land of Kittim, it was made clear to them. The idea is the people from the ships from Tarshish are coming out of Kittim, which is even further south and largely in Egypt, and Tarshish is Phoenicians, and they're just doing transporting. So they're taking the goods, and when they arrive, they find that Tyre has fallen. You know, they don't have the communications like we do today. So they leave, and they find it fallen. It was made clear to them. It says, be struck dumb, inhabitants of the coast, and merchants of Sidon. Sidon was a powerful city, and it was just opposite Tyre. It was on the land, and Tyre was on the island. And so this idea of the merchants of Sidon, and an awful lot of trade took place in Sidon with goods that were held in Tarshish and Tyre, and then sent in and sold there for goods that were traded. And just think of Tyre as a bank, but a bank that would store food, store all kinds of things. So the merchants of Sidon, whose messengers crossed the sea on the wide ocean, the grain of the canal, the harvest of the Nile, formed her revenue. And again, Tyre was involved in storage of all these things and in the money she took from that. She was the market for all the nations. Be ashamed, Sidon, harbor by the sea, for the sea has said, I feel no birth pangs, I do not give birth, never rear boys, nor bring up girls. It's the idea that the sea is stable. It's not going to be stronger or weaker or anything. The sea is stable. And once this path is built, then Tyre is gone, period. It's not going to be restored or anything. And again, once this causeway was built, the, what do you want to call it, the currents that come down the coast, then didn't wash that out, but built up soil against it. So when you look on a map, unless you know where Tyre is supposed to be, You wouldn't even notice it. You wouldn't even notice it. It says, when the news reaches Egypt, they will tremble to hear about Tyre. And again, it's the idea, if Tyre can fall, no one's safe. Absolutely no one's safe. Because Tyre had everything going for it as far as defense. Cross to Tarshish, howl, inhabitants of the coast. And the reason the inhabitants of the coast, that's the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians their whole thing was trade. So probably the major place of trade for them was to bring stuff to Tyre and to take stuff from Tyre to places. So with Tyre gone, that their major thing is missing. Is this your proud city, founded far back in the past, whose steps led her far afield to found her colonies? And the Phoenicians were in a relationship with Tyre, and the cities that the Phoenicians founded, and they founded cities like all around the Mediterranean, it was Tyre who aided them in founding the city, financed the founding of the cities. And he says that it is this thing whose traders were princes, whose merchants, men honored by the world. And they weren't really princes, but they were wealthy. And so they lived very powerfully. One of my favorite quotes from J.P. Morgan was that in the United States, anyone with $1 million can live like a prince. And it's the thing is, if you have a lot of money, you can live like a prince. Who cares whether you got a crown? The Lord Sabaoth planned this to wither the pride of all beauty and humiliate those honored by the world. And he's saying that God allowed this so that people could understand there is no place that's absolutely safe. There's nothing that can stand, to say in absolute surety on the face of the earth, that all these things have weaknesses and that sort of thing. He says, cultivate your land like the Nile, daughter of Tarshish, for the harbor is no more. And this idea of cultivate your land like the Nile, he's saying to the people on Tyre, says you better get a job. You have to work now for a living. You aren't just this bank where people bring things into you and you take them out. That isn't what's going to happen. Now you have to work. For he has raised his hand against the sea. He has shaken kingdoms. For the Lord has commanded the destruction of the fortresses of Canaan. And again, Alexander's going through the whole land of Canaan. But the thing that he's getting at here is that the Tyre was not really one of the enemies of Israel, okay? The Tyre wasn't really anyone's enemy. They were out there, all they were about was money. They'd be friends with anyone they could make money with. That was all there was to it. But what the lesson of Tyre is, it's impossible for you to construct absolute safety on the face of the earth. You have to know that. And he's trying to get the Jews to rely more on him. God wants the Jews to rely more on him. And so this idea of the one who had it made. I remember back when I was in grade school, the whole idea was the United States was absolutely safe because we had the atomic bomb. And then when the Russians got the atomic bomb, then that was over. And the thing is, there is no absolute safety to be found on the face of the earth in that way. You simply can't do it. He has said, exalt no more, oppressed virgin, daughter of Sidon. Get up, cross to Kittim. No rest for you even there. It's the idea that they need to cross the sea and escape. They're going to abandon, Tyre. Because I mentioned it was an outcropping of rock and everything. You can't farm there or anything, and once it's destroyed as a fortress, there's nothing. So they moved there. He says, look at the land of the Chaldeans, a people who used not to exist. The Chaldeans were rising in importance at this time, largely under the influence of Alexander. That Alexander, I think everyone knows he's a Greek and everything, but the land of the Chaldeans, which is in that area lower around Persia, the land of the Chaldeans and Egypt are the places that benefited most from Alexander. In Egypt, it was the foundation of Alexandria. And then there was a lot of things that went on in the Chaldeans. And for whatever reason, and I think, Alexander got as far as India. I mean, he was really all over. But these places benefited tremendously, much more than Greece. Greece certainly had the reputation. But these places actually really benefited from Alexander. Assyria assigned it to the creatures of the wilds. They raised their siege towers against it, destroyed its resources, and reduced it to ruin. Howl, ships of Tarshish, for your fortress has been destroyed. Okay? And I think the destruction of Tyre is one of those pivotal events, again, in history, that it was a remarkable move when it happened. When that day comes, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, the length of one king's life. And understand the 70 years, according to the Bible, the lifetime of a person is 70 years. Unless you're strong, then it's 80, okay? But the life of the reign of a king would be seen as being about 30 or 40 years. They wouldn't see, so by the length of the life of the king. But when the 70 years are over, Tyre will become like the harlot in the song. And this is a quote now, a song that we know nothing about, but it must have been a song known at the time that Isaiah wrote this. He says, "Take your harp, walk around the town, harlot whom people have forgotten. Play sweetly, song after song, that they may remember you." Okay, so it's a retired prostitute, and no one's interested in her anymore. And this whole idea of her playing music, to try to remember the glory days. And the same thing with Tyre, the glory days are not going to return, and they have never. They have never really returned to Tyre. He said, at the end of 70 years, the Lord will visit Tyre. She will get back her trade and play the harlot with all the kingdoms of the world on the surface of the earth. And this idea of Tyre being restored and playing this role, you'll find this comes up in the whole book of Revelation. And the restoration of Tyre actually would be the city of Rome, that then manufactured the trail. Once they defeated Carthage, they owned the Mediterranean in the same way that Tyre had at one time. And so that they become that. And it describes in the book of Revelation the destroyer of the person who's the harlot of trade with all these other people. But there they're talking about Rome. Okay? But her profits and wages will be sacred to the Lord. Okay? So that she will play the harlot with all these different kingdoms, but her profits ultimately will come to God. They will not be stored or hoarded, but her profits will go to those who live in the Lord's presence, for them to have abundant food and splendid clothing. And the idea is that the income is ultimately to go for the good of people rather than to be stored. And you see that in a lot of the teachings of Jesus, the idea that the only things we keep in this world are the things we've given away. That's ultimately what we end up keeping. But what we keep is buried with us. But what we give away ultimately is what we have at the end of the thing. So this idea of all the wealth and everything is a wealth to be given away. Today we celebrated the feast of Margaret of Scotland. And she comes from probably the most prolific producer of saints of any family in the world. Tomorrow is the feast of Elizabeth of Hungary, and she's I think, great-grand niece of Elizabeth of Margaret of Scotland. Margaret of Scotland is one of the descendants from Saint Stephen in Hungary. But the royal family in Hungary has a whole series of saints, and Saint Stephen being the first one. And she was married to the King of Scotland called Malcolm. And she was married to Malcolm in an effort. She was going there to try and civilize the Scots, okay? And but it's very interesting, her definition of civilization. She says a civilized person is the person whose actions benefit the people under them. An uncivilized person is a person whose actions use the people under them. And she maintained that everyone had a position. Like, for instance, if you're let's say you're a king, you have all these people under you. But if you're a courtier, you have the king above you, but you have servants under you. And, you take finally you get to someone and you have your dog, But whatever, that you can tell how civilized a person is by how they treat the ones under them. And so this was what she brought to Scotland, and that was her definition. And she's probably one of the most famous people in all of history as far as giving away her jewelry, her clothing, food, this sort of thing. Like every time a meal was prepared in the palace, half of it had to go out and be distributed to the poor automatically before they started the meal at the palace. And she did these sort of things, but the main purpose of it was to be an example to the country. Now, whether or not she civilized the Scots, I think is a debatable question, but she became a saint trying. That's probably the key thing about this. Okay? So, now we go into another one. It says, "See how the Lord is laying the earth waste, making it a desert, buckling its surface, and scattering its inhabitants." And he's talking about the idea of the fall of Tyre and these different cities that depended on Tyre and all this sort of thing, and how all this is coming about. He says, "It will be the same for priest as for people, for master as for slave, for mistress as for maid, for seller as for buyer, for lender as for borrower, for creditor as for debtor." So what he's talking about here now, we talked about earlier that in the early days, if you invaded a city, you always let the king off for these sort of things. But as this disaster comes, it's going to hit everyone. No one's going to be exempt. And so this sweeps over, and it does not make distinctions according to the distinctions we make in society. Do you know where you see a lot of this is in the literature produced in Europe during the Black Plague? That it didn't really matter if you were the king or you were a laundry maid, that some got it and died and some didn't, but there was no class distinction or anything like that. He says, ravaged the earth will be, despoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word. Okay? So this is what the Lord speaks. The earth is languishing, withering away. The heavens are withering with the earth. The earth is defiled beneath its inhabitants, for they have transgressed the laws, violated the decree, and broken the everlasting covenant. So he says the destruction of the earth is going on largely because people have not been faithful to God. I probably have told you that there's a whole field of theology that's probably developed in the last maybe 50 years. It hadn't started when I was studying theology, but it was beginning by the time I was finishing. And it's a theology of ecology. And this is one of the texts they use. And they say, what is the everlasting covenant? The everlasting covenant is found in the second story of creation, where it says God created the earth and had all the stuff here, and he created man to take care of it. And we violated the covenant of care of the earth. And so all this stuff, comes back on us. But this covenant to take care of the earth. And we have in our theology a very ancient saying. I have no idea where it comes from, but it is extremely ancient. And the saying is that God forgives, but nature avenges. And that these things, you don't walk away from them. Therefore, a curse has consumed the earth, and its inhabitants pay the penalty. And one of the real problems with this, like for instance in the papal letter on the environment, the Pope said that what people don't understand is that the way we are treating the environment is actually a social justice issue. And the reason it's a social justice issue is I am deciding the world in which my children will live. And I'm deciding the world that will go on for generations. And, I've no right to be so warm and comfortable in my house if the price of that is they will be impossible for them to heat their house, this sort of thing. So he says, therefore, the inhabitants of the earth have been burned up, and few people are left. It's very interesting in the light of what's going on, that ultimately the inhabitants are burned up. I think of that in terms of the heat. Did anyone hear on the news today the unusual thing that happened in England today on the coast? There's a walrus on one of the beaches in England today. And why? The thing is lost because of climate change. A walrus has never been seen in England. The walrus, is up on ice floes somewhere. I don't know if they're in Antarctica or, I think they're in Antarctica, they're north. But the idea is that this whole thing is confusing creation, flat out confusing creation. And they said that something like 3/4 of the barrier reef in Australia now is dead. That's horrendous things. He says, the new wine is mourning, the vine is withered away, and the merry-hearted are sighing. The mirth of the tambourines is silent, the sound of reveling is over. The cheerful sound of the harp is silent. And so, first of all, the new wine is mourning. I don't know if you've ever had new wine, but one time Mark Stetz and I were in, where was it? We were in Germany, traveling through Germany, and he told me, I never knew about this, but in the laws that Ludwig the Mad passed in Germany, one of the laws he passed is that you could not tax any wine if it was sold on the grounds of the winery. And by sold, I mean you can't buy a bottle and take it off. You have to drink it there, okay? But if you drink it there, that can't be taxed. Now, why he made that law, I don't know, but that may well be why he's called Ludwig the Mad. And anyway, so Mark said the wonderful thing at this time is to go to the wineries on the thing and have lunch there. And when you order wine, you order it in a huge pitcher that comes in every day for 2 meals, lunch and dinner. He and I had wine, prosciutto, and melon. That's a great way to live, I could live on wine, melon, prosciutto, and sushi. That'd do it, you know. I think that'd be the ideal thing. But one of the things about it is they take the wine like out of the barrels, and so the fermented wine and everything, they actually have bottled and sold. So as we were going down the valley to the different wineries, it was becoming more and more wine. But it started at the beginning almost pure grape juice, and because they do what they have on the thing there. And so new wine in the history at the time was considered really wonderful, because you didn't add water to it like you did to regular wine, and it had a lower alcoholic content. You could drink a lot of it. And so they really liked it. And it was very hard to get. You only have new wine for a certain period of time, and then it's gone. So this idea that it was very much a part of their parties and all that stuff, but it's all gone. That's all over. He says, no more do they sing over their wine. Liquor tastes bitter to the drinker. Okay? And this idea of a liquor being bitter to the drinker, it is really a symbol of pleasures that wear out, you know, that no longer appeal. And I think it's an interesting thing to think in terms of the pandemic. You know, there are all kinds of things we used to enjoy doing you can't enjoy today. And this idea of the liquor becoming bitter is the idea of there are all kinds of things that can destroy pleasures for people. Pleasures that have been part of their life for a really long time. And you watch that a lot of times in sportsmen who, you know, are really at the top of their game and everything, Olympic champions and stuff. And over a period of time in their life, just naturally, they cannot do that. And for them, you know, what made their life, I found, to me, the best sportsmen I've ever met are all addicts, but they're addicted to their sport. So like, for instance, I had a friend who was an Olympic swimmer at Pauley. You know, he used to get up practically in the middle of the night and swim several hours before classes went on, and then he returned to the pool at the end of the classes, you know, and he was either swimming, sleeping, studying, or eating. That was it. And to be honest, swimming was an addiction for him. He loved it, you know. I maintain, my personal opinion is Americans are addictive people. And the key is pick a good addiction. You know, to be addicted to, what do you call it, running, or to be addicted to, and I think all of us know runners who are flat out addicted to running. But to be addicted to some of these things is healthy. But the idea is that we can have anything like this that's really important at one time to another to become really bad. I remember when my sister was going through chemotherapy, there are a couple of foods, and just regular foods that she really loved, that she couldn't eat, could not stand the taste of while she was going through. I understand that happens with foods with regards to pregnancy too, as the things people like or dislike changes radically. The city of nothingness is in ruins. Every house is shut so that no one can enter. People cry out for wine in the streets. All joy has vanished. Happiness is banished from the land. Now, the reason they're crying out for wine is they're really crying out for the celebrations that are all over and that sort of thing. And I'd like you to know that this is an apocalyptic passage, but it's not specifically to a place. It's just that we went through these places, and we're going to go through some more places too. But we went through some places. Now, this is just pure apocalyptic. Now, apocalyptic is one thing to know about apocalyptic literature. All apocalyptic literature was written while in jail. All apocalyptic literature was written while in jail. And so if we read the book of Daniel, Daniel was a slave in Babylon. If we read the book of Revelation, John was a prisoner on the island of Patmos. That everything of apocalyptic, these sections of apocalyptic were also written in prison. And I think that the way to understand this would be if we could take two groups of people. One group were in prison in Soledad, and one group were playing golf in Pebble Beach. And the group in the very early morning, the group in prison in Soledad, and when the guard brings in their cappuccino and croissant in the morning, they open their newspaper, and you can hear rejoicing and excitement all over the entire prison. And the group of people that have just finished their rounds on the early morning golf course in Pebble Beach and sit down to their mimosa and open the paper, you'll notice that everyone who looks at the paper immediately leaves. They leave behind whatever they're eating and everything. If you look at the headlines in the paper says, all institutions are gone. There are no police, there are no armies, and if you're in prison, this is the best news you've ever heard in your life. If you happen to be at Pebble Beach, you're about to be looted, okay? So it's a very different thing. And in order to understand apocalyptic literature, you have to understand it is written by a prisoner who this destruction benefits, okay? That's how this is written. And that's true with the book of Revelation. It was written to Christians who were dying for the faith. And God was saying, this will all be destroyed like that, and this sort of thing, and you'll be delivered, you come to everlasting life. But it talks about the destruction. It's really important for us to remember where it's written so that it doesn't come across as depressing to us, because it basically speaks of saving. He says, nothing but rubble in the city. The gate has collapsed in ruins. And I think you understand, once the gate of a city is gone, the city is gone. That's the only way they can protect it. For at the heart of the earth, among all the peoples, it is like an olive tree that is beaten, as at the gleaning of the grapes when the grape harvest is over. The way they harvest olives, and they do it mechanically now. Mechanically, there's a big machine that goes up and grabs the trunk of the olive tree and shakes it violently. And all the ripe olives will fall off. And then they gather them out. They usually put a tarp underneath and do it. Well, in the old days, they didn't have those machines, but they would try and shake the tree, and they come off. And then the second thing is the gleaning. The olives that are not ripe will not fall off. And so what you do is you wait and go back later, and then you can take these or pick them. I think in Jewish law you can't do that. In Jewish law, once you've harvested, you can't go back and glean, because the olives that stayed on the tree, God left for poor people so that they could come in and get them. So you're supposed to leave those alone. Same thing when you harvest a field. When you harvest a field, if you drop a bundle of grain or something, you can't pick it up, because that God leaves it for the poor people. Remember in the book of Ruth, where Ruth would follow and pick up the stuff they had dropped and this sort of thing? And that's because as a poor person, she was entitled to it. They see that as belonging. There are huge things in the Jewish practice with regards to raising animals and the use of ground and all this stuff that are unbelievably ecological, that for some reason have been really lost over a period of time. They raise their voices, shouting for joy in the Lord's honor. They shout more loudly than the sea. This idea, the people who were in the prison now, the people are rejoicing over the fall of Babylon, over the fall of all these places. The absolute destruction is for them a benefit. Therefore, give glory to the Lord in the east, in the islands of the sea. To the name of the Lord, the God of Israel, we hear psalms from the ends of the earth. Glory to the righteous one. But the idea is that now in the the destruction of the enemies and the exoneration of the people, that God will be honored. Not only that, but then the honor of God will spread to other nations. It's curious that very often when the Jews pray, that's the way they pray, you know, that what kind of a God are you going to look like if this happens to us? You know, that we ask you to bless us for the sake of your own reputation. But I thought, I have my secret. I have my secret. Woe is me. The traitors have betrayed. The traitors have betrayed most treacherously. Fear the pit and the snare for you who dwell on the earth. The idea where this goes on, you know, I see this happening to all these places, then I realize, well, I'm not perfect either. So what's happened to me? And the idea that we see in Scripture is where really bad things happen to people, they're calling us to avoid the bad things in order to avoid what happens to the people, you know. And I think one of the great weaknesses historically is that we have always presented heaven as the reward for being good and hell as the punishment for being bad. And that relates to pie in the sky and this sort of thing. But what you need to do, I think, is learn to promote the benefits of good as it's done. You know, like for instance, if all the people in a community are fed and all the people are housed, all the people are taken care of, the reason for crime oftentimes disappears. And so there's a real benefit from that. Is there a punishment in hell for doing bad? Yes, there is. But in my experience, there's a punishment on the face of the earth for all evil we do too. And I think it's much easier for people to see the benefit of doing good on the face of the earth and the punishment for doing evil on the face of the earth. It's much better to preach that and people to see that rather than to deal with some pie in the sky, which they may or may not believe in. Now, do I believe there is an eternal reward for the good? Yes. I just don't think you can hold that up as a goal, as an example to people. Do I believe there's an eternal punishment? I do. But I don't think you can use that as a threat with people. What you can use, though, is the visibility of what happens. And to me, the best example of that historically is smoking. When they wanted to get people to stop smoking, I was a little boy, and everyone smoked. I have a mild allergy to cigarette smoke, and the general advice I got from doctors, from my parent, for everyone, was get over it. Everyone smokes, okay? And so I really remember the time. In fact, I reminded my mother when she told me about the idea of, you just need to get used to it. Everyone smokes, everything. And she came to my 25th anniversary of ordination here at the mission. I told her, you can't smoke in any hotel in San Luis Obispo. I said, you need to know that before you come, because if you do, they will throw you out of the hotel, And so the things had changed that much, but how did it change? The Tuberculosis Society, which is what it was called at the time, the Tuberculosis Society began to tell people what smoking did to people. And they began to promote it as to what was going on, and they began to study it, because the only thing that they really promoted originally was emphysema, because that's the only real problem they solved from it. And now we know it causes heart disease, it causes this, it causes cancer, it causes all these things. But it's interesting, we never passed a law against smoking. Just what happened is people realized, and over again, it became just impossible to smoke, and the whole thing. But I believe you can do that with any evil. And one of the great problems I find with the whole abortion issue is they've never bothered to look in at the effect of abortion on a woman who has an abortion. And to begin to examine that and look at it seriously. Because if it's really that wrong, and I believe it is, but if it's really that wrong, there are natural consequences you can find, and to be able to do that. And if, again, with the tuberculosis thing, the first thing they found out was how smoking affected non-smokers, and they found out smokers don't care about that. So that was didn't pursue it. But they found out what smokers did care about. The major thing with women was appearance. Remember those ads with the women with the really puckered faces? And the main thing that appealed to men was impotency, both of which are results from the smoking thing. But once they found them, then they used them. And I think all evil is that way. If it's evil, then there's something wrong in the world, in the way it's done. I remember a woman, she had some disability. I don't think it was dyslexia, but she had a bad disability, and she went through an agricultural school. It may even have been Pauli, but she went through an agricultural school and then went to work for one of the companies that produces beef. And just because of her disability, the way it caused her to think, she changed the way in which cattle are slaughtered everywhere in the world. And she found out that when cattle move, they move in a circle. And they don't, and when you're trying to get them in the chute, you're like individual, it's terrifying to them. And even in the Jewish tradition, they know that the attitude of the animal, like you do not want an animal killed while it's flooding itself with adrenaline, because that affects the taste of everything. You don't want that. So what she did was build circular things where they went into a slaughterhouse down a circular thing. The cattle all move calmly, peacefully down. This sort of thing. And everything you can do to make it easier for the animals to raise is better for you and for the animal. Everything. There's all kinds of things like that. And I just think, it's a shame we don't exploit it. He says, whoever flees from the city of fear will fall into the pit. Whoever climbs out of the pit will be caught in the snare. Basically, there's no escape, so no matter how you do it. Okay? For the sluice gates above are open. The foundations of the earth are quaking. Now, the sluice gates, I think is rain. So he's talking flooding. And the next thing he's talking is earthquakes. A cracking. The earth cracks open, volcanoes. A jolting. The earth gives a jolt. We're back to earthquakes. A lurching. The earth lurches back and forth. Notice they concentrate a lot on the earthquakes because that's the big thing in the Mideast. They have lots of the earthquakes. And it's because, I think because of the Dead Sea and that how deep that area is. It's a very geologically active area. It says, the earth will reel to and fro like a drunkard. It'll be shaken like a hut. So heavy its sin that it will fall no more to rise. Now notice they're talking the whole earth. They aren't talking city stuff, they're talking earth. It says, when that day comes, the Lord will punish the enemies of the sky, in the sky above, and on earth, the kings of the earth. They will be huddled together like prisoners in a dungeon, and shut up in a prison, and after long years, punished. And the idea there's no escape. There's punishment for the sky, the sea, this sort of thing. Now again, in ecology, they're talking about the corruption of the sky in the same way that we've corrupted the sea, this sort of thing. It says, the moon will be confused, the sun ashamed, for the Lord Sabaoth is king on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and will be glorified in the presence of his elders. And then ultimately, God is glorified by all of this series of disasters. Okay? We'll call it there and pick it up with a happier section next. The next section deals with a prayer of thanksgiving for the deliverance of those who survived.